not advertising or trying to sell you anything. If the mouthwash you're using is not the right kind and it tastes sort of like sheep dip, why, you just have to go right on using it. I can't advise any other kind at all.
Oklahoma, land of the sunny west, I'm coming back to you.
Clem Van Rogers and Mary Rogers were Cherokee pioneers in the Oklahoma Indian Territory, and their son Will learned the lore and skills of the ranching West. Yet the momentum of national growth was away from the self-sufficient man. We were moving toward an organized industrial society.
Oklahoma, land of the sunny west, I'm coming back home to you.
By 1910, the mass of urban Americans lived in big cities like New York, where Rogers played vaudeville after years traveling the global rodeo circuit. In a Baltimore theater in 1916, Will Rogers launched himself as a national commentator. President Wilson was in the audience, and Rogers joshed him about General Pershing's recent raid into Mexico in search of Pancho Villa. "I've seen where they captured Villa. Yes, caught him in the morning editions, but the afternoon ones let him get away. We chased him across the line 5 miles, but ran into a lot of government red tape and had to come back." Wilson joined in the laughter. Will Rogers came into the spotlight as a humorist specializing in national issues. So here's a souvenir of the 20s from boom to bust, viewed by Will Rogers, a man who himself moved from an imaginary Cracker Barrel to a real soapbox.
I believe it was in the period of the Ziegfeld Follies, or possibly a little bit earlier when he was in New York, that my father began to become interested in commenting on topical events. You see, he was a comedian, and comedians need material for their humor. And so he began to look in the newspapers for the humor, and that was where he began his phrase, "All I know is what I read in the newspapers." And I think the record is rather clear that his type of humor up to the Follies period was more or less stylized and rather could be compared to that of any other person in the vaudeville. But after he had been in New York for a year or so, he began reading the newspapers, he became interested in politics, he went down to Washington, and then he sort of made topical humor his trademark.
Every morning when Mr. Rogers would come in, as soon, that is, as he was finished with a scene, he'd sit down and read and read and read in the newspapers of that morning. Then he'd get apparently the idea that would spark his column, and he'd go over to his typewriter, peck away, get it in pretty much the shape, I guess, that he wanted it in, and then he'd look around, and whoever happened to be standing near, it might be a technician, it might be an actor, perhaps a visitor on the set, call them over and hand them the copy. It was rough copy. Say, "I'd like you to read that." Now, very often, until he became wise to what was going on, the person might not know why he was asked to read it, but he'd read it. And Rogers would feign indifference. He would pretend not to be paying any attention. But if you looked at him, you could see that his eyes were slanted up, and he was catching every shade of expression that crossed his reader's face.
The Versailles Treaty. It wasn't a good treaty, but it was the only one they had. We got in on the signing of it. We got nothing out of the treaty outside of the pen that we signed with was all that we got. They had been about a year messing it or fixing it all up, you know, all these nations. How it come to take them so long to sign it up, they was dividing up the islands and the possessions, Germany's possessions, islands and the colonies and all around. And we didn't get any. We said, well, we went in for nothing, and they all agreed that was a good idea. And we got out with it. In good shape. No, not in good shape, but we got out with it anyhow. That's one good thing about European nations. They can't hate you so bad they wouldn't use you.
The little old Ford, it rambled right along, and the little old Ford, it rambled right along. Now cut that out, you naughty tease. 'Tis a left-hand drive and a right-hand squeeze. Patch it up.
After the war, America began its love affair with the automobile. Americans were on wheels everywhere, exhilarated by their new automobility.
And the little Ford will ramble right along.
Gentlemen, you too, politicians. The Democrats are the middle-of-the-road party. The Republicans are the straddle-of-the-road party. So I hereby nominate Mr. Henry Ford for president and christen the party the all-over-the-road party. He's the first man that ever took a joke and made it practical. So let's let him take this country. Maybe he can repeat. There's no reason why there shouldn't be a Ford in the White House. They're everywhere else. Some are against him because he don't know history. What we need in there is a man that can make history, not recite it. Now, if Mr. Ford will just take another one of my suggestions, he can be elected. If he will just make one speech and say, voters, if I am elected, I will change the front on them.
To Will Rogers, the increasing swarm of cars symbolized the many changes which machines were introducing into American life. Rogers had in mind some of the more humorous effects of industrialization when he issued this birthday salute to Henry Ford. Henry Ford has had more influence on the lives and habits of this nation than any other man. Great educators try to teach people, great teachers try to change people, but no man produced has moved the world like Henry Ford. He put wheels on our homes. A man's castle is his sedan. Life's greatest catastrophe is a puncture. Everybody is rushing to go somewhere where they have no business so they can hurry back to the place they never should have left. So, good luck, Mr. Ford. It will take 100 years to tell whether you have helped us or hurt us. But you certainly didn't leave us like you found us.
Traffic chiefs from all over the world. I am here to represent what is left of a vanishing race, and that is the pedestrian. Here are a few rules which I want you to adopt. Eliminate all right and left-hand turns. Make everybody go straight ahead. Rule 2, eliminate all streetcars from the streets. They only get in people's way who are in a hurry walking home. Third, to speed up traffic, have a man hired by the city in each block to do nothing but crank stall Ford cars. 4, nobody is to drive on Sunday but just the weekend drivers who don't drive any other day. Then all they can hit is each other. Have everybody going east go on Monday. Everybody going west go Tuesday, and so on. That's the only way you will ever make the streets of the United States safe for democracy.
In the film Don't Park There, Will Rogers portrayed a country bumpkin named Jubilo, a visitor to the city who has trouble adjusting to the intricate rules of urban America's machine culture. Jubilo may have destroyed his Model T, but the real Will Rogers was more fortunate. One morning in 1928, he awoke to discover a complimentary Model A outside his Santa Monica ranch. What greater tribute could Henry Ford have paid the Oklahoma humorist? As if to comply with Will's request, Ford had changed the front on him.
He was a compulsive traveler. He seemed to always want to be on the go. If he was here in this house for more than a week or so, he'd start looking around trying to invent reasons to go to Washington or to go to San Francisco or things of that sort. And he also liked to keep not a record of his travels, but possibly a geographic map of where he had been. Now, over his desk in his den there is a series of maps of the different continents and the big hook, and he could hook up and roll this particular map down.
As Innocents Abroad, Will Rogers' silent film characters rejected the protocol and pretentiousness of polite society. Against the wishes of his socially ambitious wife, Ambassador Alfalfa Doolittle decides to meet the king, Oklahoma style.
I think Dad represented what we think of as fundamentally American at that particular time. He wanted us to be the most powerful country in the world. He wanted us to have a big army and navy and later on a big air force. But he didn't want us to use it. He didn't want to see America go into Nicaragua, for example. He didn't want to see us send the Marines to China or anything of that sort. He was very outspoken that way. He was anti-imperialist. He didn't want us to run other people's business. He says, what are we doing running other people's business? You can't even run your own. He says, for goodness sakes, we send Marines to China? How would we like it if the China sent Marines up the Mississippi River saying they had to protect their laundries in Memphis?
This is Charles Evans Hughes, about to attend the 1921 Arms Limitations Conference held in Washington. Military preparedness was a dominant issue of the 20s. General Billy Mitchell's famous bombing demonstrations convinced Rogers that a large air force would better protect America than disarmament treaties. As a shrewd observer of men and nations, Will Rogers had little faith that treaties would ever change human nature.
Our home savior had a plan, in fact 10 of them. He left them to us, and he knew they'd help us, and we know they'll help us. He said, love thy neighbors thyself, but I bet there ain't two people in your block that's speaking to each other. We know that all these things, we know them all in our own heart, but I don't know, we just ain't gonna do them, that's all.
After he discovered airplanes, he never traveled any other way if he could help it. He loved to fly on planes. He rode on the mail planes. He flew around Europe, short trips, long trips, anytime that he could. One of his best discussions on planes occurs in the book Bathing Suit in Russia and Other Bare Facts, which sounds like a joke. It's a very serious book in many ways. He fussed about America sitting back and letting all the rest of the world get ahead of us in aviation. Lindbergh was a hero to Will Rogers. Lots of pilots were in those early days, and of course it was in May of 1927 when Lindbergh made the flight. And that day in Will Rogers' column, he said he wouldn't even try to make jokes. There's no way he could make jokes that day. With this bashful, tall, slim American out over the Atlantic Ocean where no man had ever been all alone before. And of course in the days following, when Lindbergh came home and they had the ticker tape parades and all this, he wrote about him every day. But he still hadn't met him. It was in September of that year before he got a chance to meet him. Lindbergh was making some appearances all over the United States on behalf of aviation. And he was coming to Southern California, where Will was working on a movie. And he said in his column again that he's the one person in the whole world that I'd get me a soapbox and I'd stand on the corner and peek over and try to get a look at him.
Lindbergh surmounted physical barriers. During the 20s, new women were crossing social barriers.
Aren't women wonderful? Aren't women grand? Aren't they the rulers of this happy land? They fly the Atlantic while countries explore, where lions and tigers and savages roar. Then they faint dead away when they see a little mouse on the floor. Boys, aren't women wonderful? Aren't women grand?
Now that the applesauce and bologna is all over, and we will try and state a few facts about this affair. I want to compliment the artist in the first place. He's done a wonderful job. That's the first time we've really seen a long skirt in years, you know? And it looks beautiful. You know, it's lovely. She got the button on her arm. That's in case, you know, she runs into a modern party, she'll have her costume in there, in this thing. That's a wonderful figure of the boy. That's the cleanest face I ever saw in an Oklahoma boy. You know, that woman's got on a corset, you know, and we haven't seen one in years, but she's got one on. You know, I've been to parties, I've been to affairs with the old-time woman when she, you know, at dinner parties when she couldn't see out over
This film of a federal assault on an illicit still looks more like an episode from a G-Man serial than real life. Prohibition of alcoholic beverages in the 20s was another example of America's misguided efforts to legislate morality. Rogers showed people the hypocrisy of prohibition by chiding a presidential commission headed by a man named Wickersham.
Look at the Wickersham. Wickersham worked 2 years and spent $2 million. And what did he do with his report? Turned in a report and says, now, I won't be sure. I can't get the absolute proof, but I think there's a little drinking going on around the country.
What I remember best about the 20s was nothing specific but the fact that things seemed feverish and superficial and brittle. Everything was moving at a wild pace, changing very fast. And I think when Rogers came on the screen, there was a marvelous sense of peace that came into the audience's heart. He was not ever brittle. He was gentle and warm and full-hearted. Superficial, of course not. I mean, his humor, everything he did went right to the core of the human personality.
I worked in 3 or 4 pictures with Dad. One of them was Just Call Me Jim. Because I don't know, I think I was about 4 maybe at the time, possibly 5. I don't really remember too much about it. Then there was another one, Doubling for Romeo, and I can remember a scene at the gate when he came in a pair of big white woolly chaps and all.
Most comedians are just odd-looking, while with me, you would say, who is that distinguished-looking man walking toward the microphone? While they command immediate laughter by simply doing nothing, I command a kind of a hushed attention, rather an awe, you know? Immediately you say, there's a man with a message.
The director has been misled by appearances. Sleepy Sam Cody did not come to Hollywood to play cowboy roles. If he is to win that girl back home, he must learn to make love like Douglas Fairbanks. His big moment arrives indeed, his chance to be a Hollywood lover. The director tries to teach Sleepy Sam how to get into the spirit of silver screen romance. Let's see how he does this time.
This is the ranch that my father built, that he loved, and it really does represent him, and I think. And I'm sure that had he come back from Alaska, that he would have changed a lot of things around here, because it was always a growing thing when he was here. We children never really liked the place very much because there were no other children around. The kids were all too far. The driveway here is a mile long, and we had to go about half an hour or so before there was any neighbors. So we really didn't like it so very much. Dad originated many of the roping tricks, and he was very proud of his roping. He worked very hard at it, and he wanted it to be remembered. He wanted it to be remembered as an American art. And I think that's why he made this roping fool. In fact, he said, and it's quoted often, that he says, I made this picture so I could sit back in my rocking chair and say, now there, you young ropers, that's what I could do when I was your age.
He always had a roping horse or two around. After about 1923 or 4, he always had quite a string of polo ponies. We used to keep about 18 or 19 here in the barn, and that's because with Dad and Bill and I playing, and in those days you played 8 chuckers, it took a lot of horses to mount the whole family. My sister rode, Mother rode. And while we're speaking of horses, I'll say this, Dad was always a sticker on taking care of one. He used to tell about his father, who was one of the best horsemen he ever knew, and how his father could ride a horse all day and never get him tired. We took care of our horses. We had to. That was one of the musts around the barn. It comes down to the fact that his grandfather was one of the more advanced men of the Indian Territory, settled there. And that's where he was raised. Dad was raised in the Indian Territory. And most of his life, he sort of thought of himself as an Indian Oklahoma cowboy. The old expression, you can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy, really applies. He always thought of himself as a cowboy, as a country person, as a rural person. And I think that most of his humor, if you look at it, and the things he said, all have very definitely a rural background.
And of course, some of his best gags were always poking fun at Congress, but he always made sure it was the congressional body, not at any individual. He says, they ask me where I get my jokes, I just watch Congress and report the facts. And I never find it necessary to exaggerate.
Watch Alfalfa Doolittle solve the problems of the 20s. During the 20s, scandals touched officials at all levels of government. It was publicly boasted that one president's nomination had been guaranteed in a smoke-filled room.
I went down to Washington last week. I go down there once in a while, drop in the old joke factory there and see what the boys are doing. And compared to them, I'm an amateur. And the thing about my jokes is they don't hurt anybody. You can take them or leave them, you know what I mean? But with Congress, every time they make a joke, it's a law. You know? And every time they make a law, it's a joke.
I think his favorite was Calvin Coolidge, in which he one time said, it wasn't that Calvin done nothing, it was that he did it better than anyone else.
Congress is really just children that's never grown up, that's all they are. And now Mr. Coolidge handled the thing altogether different. Now there's a man that he handled Congress. He didn't pay no attention to them at all. He wouldn't mess with them. Congress at all. He never messed with commissions either. If the Chiefs wasn't biting in the Columbia River and the Abyssinians wasn't practicing birth control, Mr. Coolidge, he never messed with them at all. He just let it go along, you know. He never cared. He knew how to handle the whole thing.
When the boom of the 20s became the bust of the 30s, floods and droughts proved that nature and the economy were not entirely under human control. Will Rogers, who opposed the misuses of nature by a careless society, embarked on tours to revive America's conscience.
When you grow up in a country, and especially a very sparsely settled country, you sort of grow up helping your neighbor helps you. You see somebody in trouble, you don't say, I don't want to get involved. You go over and say, what can I do to help you? When these disasters hit, and they were both disasters, the flood area, of course, that was more or less in his backyard. That was down through Oklahoma, down through Arkansas, along the Mississippi River. We didn't have a government then that did a great deal. I think he felt that here's a chance that I can do something. These people need help. Anything you can do to help them, let's help them. He wasn't asking the government to do it, he was asking the people to help their fellow people.
I think that every town and every city will raise this money. In fact, they can't afford not to. They've got the money because there's as much money in the country as there ever was. Fewer people have it, but it's there. And I think the towns will all raise it, because I've been on a good many charity affairs all over the country, and I have yet to see a town or a city ever fail to raise the money when they saw the necessity. Every one of them will come through.
When the floods abated, the dust storms came. Will Rogers helped the suffering people with financial relief, but he knew that morale was dangerously low. Employing his gift for irony, he tried to supply a ray of comic relief for these darkest of times.
You know, history has shown the Lord does bury each succeeding civilization and buries them in accordance to the advancement of the people in that neighborhood. I feel proud that I come from that particular Middle West belt. If a civilization had to be buried as it becomes advanced enough, well, we feel proud that we're the ones to be plowed under first, that's all. In years to come, the archaeologists will dig and find Claremore, Oklahoma, and people will come there to the ruins and dig down and say, here lied a civilization, you know what? Well, then later on, they'll unearth the state capitol, you know, and then eventually, as Washington is covered up on account of its being the least civilized, it'll be the last place covered up. They will excavate and find the old Capitol and decipher some of the old hieroglyphics, you know, that people of those days humorously call laws. And they'll find places called banks where the money changers were, you know. Men who in those ancient days lived by interest alone.
The only problem that confronts this country today is that at least 7 million people are out of work. That's our only problem. There is no other one before it at all. It's to see that every man that wants to, able to work, is allowed to find a place to go to work. Prohibition, we hear a lot about that. Well, that's nothing to compare to your neighbor's children that are hungry. It's food, it ain't drink that we're worried about today. Here a few years ago, we were so afraid that the poor people would be liable to take a drink that now we've fixed so they can't even get something to eat. Here we are in a country with more wheat, more corn, more money in the bank, more cotton, more everything in the world. There's not a product that you can name that we haven't got more of it than any country ever had in the face of the earth. And yet we've got people starving. We'll hold the distinction of being the only nation in the history of the world that ever went to the poorhouse in an automobile. The potter's field are lined with granaries full of grain. Now, if there ain't something cockeyed in an arrangement like that, then this microphone here in front of me is, well, it's a cuspidor.
This time, the Depression had hit. He was concerned about it. He did feel it was time for a Democratic president, even though he claimed not to be either Democrat or Republican. He was pretty obviously backing the Democratic Party at that point and felt we had to have a cohesiveness in the party and in America as a whole. So he came up making a very serious speech, and I think probably had a greater impact on people than all the serious speakers combined could have had.
a government of decision, a government of action, and a government of progress. For the Democratic Party, for the United States of America, for the needs of humanity, I give to this convention the name of Alfred E. Smith and
That the candidate of this convention shall be and must be that incarnation of Thomas Jefferson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt of New York.
The 30s brought new challenges and a need for new spokesmen. Unlike such satirists as Henry Mencken, Will Rogers crossed the gap between decades. For America, Rogers summed up both the common sense of the village wise man and the modern spirit of progress. When the 1932 Democratic Convention came to deadlock in the hot Chicago summer, Rogers came forth as a spokesman for party unity.
Do me a favor, before quit. When you leave, now some of you are going to be disappointed. Some of you come here for your candidate, and your heart and soul is set on your candidate. Now, for God's sake, do this thing for us, will you? No matter who they nominate, somebody, a lot of you are going to be disappointed. But for the Lord's sake, for once in your life, go home. Don't act like Democrats. Act like he was the man you come here to see nominated. Dadgummit, get out of there. Anyone. Don't go home sore and say we nominated the weakest man and we can't win with him. You don't know whether he'll be the weakest man. The man you think will be the weakest man, if they nominate him, you don't know it till next November. Boy, they couldn't. I don't see how they could possibly be a weak enough man not to win in November. I don't know how he could be so weak. God, if he lives till next November, he's in, that's all. We must have some 80 or 90,000 people here tonight. That's the most people that ever paid to see a politician. Now, here tonight, Governor, you are not allowed to refer to politics. They won't let anyone talk politics in here because this stadium was dedicated to art, sports, and any useful enterprises. Now, Franklin, I can call you Franklin, and because I've known you for many years. You used to come to the Follies as a boy and see our show. In fact, you come there as an old man to see it, too. And he used to come to the Follies, and like all notables, I would ask him to get up and say something. And I would think he was going to get up and maybe say something nice about Ziegfield's show. But he would get up and nominate Smith for something. I don't know what he would do. And I'm sure, Governor, that Mr. Smith, certain righteousness and charity of heart, appreciates all these things that you've done for him these many years, and I'm sure that he will repay you. I only hope that he does it before election, that's all. And now, I'm going to quit. I'm going to leave you all, and wait a minute. I know comedy is no novelty on this rostrum. It's a shame. It's a terrible thing for a comedian to get up here and have to follow what I have. But I will say that this is the only intentional comedy that's been here. You know what I mean? But listen, do go home, will you? Goodbye and good luck to you.
Thank you.